The coffee was stale, not burnt, not bitter, just stale. The kind of smell that sits in a room where the urn has been sitting for 3 hours too long and nobody thought to make a fresh pot. I noticed it the second I walked in because I always notice smells before I notice anything else. Something about the way the brain works. Smell goes straight to the part that remembers. I had my clipboard against my chest. I wasn't supposed to set it down anywhere. Instructions. The folder inside it had the seating chart on it, which I had already memorized for the third time that morning, but I kept holding it because holding it made me look like I had a reason to be standing exactly where I was standing and not somewhere else. That was my job, to look like I belonged. This is the part I need you to understand before anything else. Nobody talks about what the room actually felt like. You have seen the footage. You have your version of what happened in that room. I have mine, and it is not the same footage. I was not watching on a screen. I was breathing the same air, and the air smelled like stale coffee, and that is the first thing I want you to see. I almost stopped talking about this after the first sentence. I really did. I sat down this morning and I had the words, and then I almost closed the notebook. But the part that comes next is the reason I didn't. Because there is a moment in that room, and I have never heard anyone describe it, where something happened that the cameras did not catch, and I have been carrying it for years, and I think you need to hear it. I want you to stay with me through the last part. I am not saying that to ask for anything. I am saying it because the ending only matters if you hear the whole thing, and I am going to ask you for something only once, and it is just this. Stay. The room was a hotel conference space. I know that is not a secret, but the thing about hotel conference spaces is that they all look the same on camera, and they never look the same in person. The one we were in had been set up for a taped event, which meant the lights were different than they should have been, flatter, harsher, coming from positions that made the walls look yellow instead of white. There were maybe 40 people in the room. I had counted earlier that morning during the walkthrough, because counting things is what I did when I did not know what else to do. The table was a long rectangle, dark wood. There were microphones on stands at 3 positions, and the teleprompter screens were behind the cameras, not visible to the people sitting at the table. That is something most people do not realize. The people at the table cannot see what is scrolling across the teleprompter unless they look up and to the side, which is something you learn not to do because it makes you look like you are reading. So the people at the table are mostly guessing, or remembering, or saying whatever comes naturally. I was standing near the door. Not at the door, near it. There is a difference. At the door means you are leaving. Near the door means you are close enough to leave if you need to, and you are also close enough to hear anything that is said in a normal voice within about 6 feet of where you are standing. I know exactly how far 6 feet is now, because I have spent a lot of time standing in rooms thinking about the distance between myself and the most powerful people in the room. There was a pitcher of water on the side table near where I was standing. I had not poured it. The hotel staff had done that, and whoever filled it had used ice water because I could see the condensation on the outside of the glass, and the ice had shifted slightly when the staff member set the pitcher down. I noticed that because I had been told to watch for things like that. Not the ice, just things, small things. Things that told you whether a room was ready, whether a person was nervous, whether something was about to happen that was not on the schedule. There was a chair near the window that was different from the others. I noticed that in the walkthrough, all the other chairs were the same, black, padded with arms. This one was also black and padded and had arms, but it was slightly lower than the others, maybe 2 inches, and the cushion was newer. Someone had made a last-minute switch. I did not know why. I found out later why, but I did not know at the time. Here is the thing about the morning of that day. I had been given one specific instruction that I did not understand, and I want you to know it was there, even though I am not going to explain it yet. My supervisor had pulled me aside before the room filled up and told me that if anyone at the table asked me to do something, anything, I was to do it immediately and not ask why. That was the instruction. Do it immediately and do not ask why. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say to someone whose job was mostly carrying folders and making sure the water pitchers were full, but I nodded, I said okay, and I did not ask why. I would find out later why that mattered. The first people to arrive were the technical crew. They moved in a specific pattern, cameras first, then sound, then lights. You learn the pattern after a while. It is like watching a dance that has been choreographed by people who do not think of it as choreography. The cameras went to the positions that had been marked on the floor with tape. The sound people ran wires under the rug. The lights got adjusted twice, and then a third time, and I watched the person doing the lighting walk over to one of the producers and say something that made the producer shake their head. And then the lights got adjusted a fourth time. The room was not ready until almost exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled start. And I know that because I was watching the clock on the wall and also the clock on my phone, and they were 6 seconds apart, which meant I was nervous about time in two different places. The press people came in next. There were maybe 12 of them, and they were guided to the section on the left side of the room behind the cameras in the rows of chairs that had been set up facing the table. They were not supposed to ask questions during the event. That was the rule. They could take notes, they could watch, they could be present, but the questions would come later, and until later they were just bodies in chairs, and I was just a body near the door, and everyone was just being present. I remember the smell of the coffee getting thicker as the room filled up. That was the stale part. It was not the smell of fresh coffee. It was the smell of coffee that had been sitting and waiting, and the longer it sat, the more it smelled like waiting. That sounds like something I am making up, but it is not. Smell is memory. You already know that. I am just telling you which smell this was. I saw Michelle Obama come in before her husband did. That is something I do not hear people talk about very much, the order in which people arrive. She came in from the side entrance, not the main door, and she moved to her seat first and sat down and looked at the table in front of her for maybe 5 seconds before anyone else came in. She was not checking her phone. She was not talking to anyone. She was just sitting and looking, and I remember thinking that she looked like someone who was preparing. Not rehearsing. Preparing. There is a difference. One is about words, the other is about something deeper than words. Barack Obama came in maybe 2 minutes after her. He walked differently than she did, a little faster, more direct, and he went to his seat and sat down and adjusted his jacket the way a man does when he has been told to wear a jacket, and the jacket is slightly uncomfortable and he is trying to pretend it is not. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the press section. He looked at the empty chair across the table. That is when I knew the other person was coming. The way a person enters a room tells you everything about them. I do not mean that as a metaphor. I mean it as a fact. I have stood in enough rooms to know that how someone walks through a door is the most honest thing about them, because they do not know they are being watched yet, or they think they are being watched for a different reason, or they have forgotten that they are being watched. And in any of those moments, the body does something that the face will not do later. The body tells the truth. He walked in and he was loud about it. Not with his voice, with the space he took up. He filled the doorway. That is the only way I know how to say it. The doorway is a specific size, and most people pass through it without making it smaller or larger, but he made it smaller because he is a man who has never understood the concept of taking up less space than he wants to take. That is not an insult. It is just an observation. It is the kind of thing you notice when you are standing near a door and you are watching. He said something to one of his aides as he walked past. I could not hear what because he said it low and fast and I was 6 feet away, and then he went to his chair and he pulled it out and he sat down and the chair made a sound. Not the scrape of a chair being pulled out from under a table. Something else. Something like the chair was surprised. I do not know how to explain it better than that. The chair made a sound that was slightly too loud, and he did not seem to notice, and everyone else pretended not to notice, and I noticed. And I wrote it down later, and I am telling you now because it is the kind of detail that disappears on camera. I have not said this yet, but I should. I was a junior aide. I was instructed not to speak unless spoken to. That was the job, to be present but quiet, to be useful but invisible. I carried the clipboard because carrying the clipboard was something I was supposed to do, even though the clipboard did not need to be carried. It needed to be held. There is a difference. The clipboard was evidence that I belonged there. Without it, I was just a person standing near a door, and standing near a door is something anyone can do. I want to go back to the smell for a second. I know I said that already, but I need you to understand that the smell of the room is something I can still reproduce in my mind right now, this second, if I close my eyes and think about it. The stale coffee was in the air, but there was also something else underneath it, the smell of the carpet cleaner that the hotel used, something piney and sharp. Like the room had been cleaned early that morning and the cleaning had left a trace that the people were slowly covering up with their breath and their bodies and their worry. The room smelled like a room that was waiting. I have never forgotten that smell. I have smelled it in other rooms since then, and every time I do, I am back there holding the clipboard, watching the door. I want to talk about the first tell. There are 3 of them. They are things I saw that the cameras did not catch, and I need to tell you about all 3 because together they tell a story that the footage does not tell. The first tell happened almost immediately. The other person, the one across the table, he had a habit. I noticed it before he sat down when he was walking to his chair, and I noticed it again after he sat down, and I noticed it every time he listened to something that Michelle Obama said. It was a swallow. Not a normal swallow. Not the kind you do when your throat is dry or you need to clear something. It was a swallow that came one beat too late. What I mean is this. When someone says something to you, your body has a response, and the response usually happens right away in the half second after they finish speaking. But his swallow came later. 1 second. Maybe 2. Like his throat was deciding whether to swallow or not, and it took longer than it should have, and then it finally did, and the swallow was louder than it should have been, and I could hear it from where I was standing. The first time it happened was when the introductions were being made. Michelle had said something. I do not remember what. It was a greeting, something routine. And he had nodded and smiled and said something back. And then a second later he swallowed, and the sound of it cut through the room for just a moment, and nobody else seemed to hear it, but I heard it, because I was standing close enough and I was listening for something, anything, that would tell me what was about to happen. The second tell I want to tell you about is the foot. I almost missed it. It was underneath the table, and I would not have been able to see it if I had not been positioned exactly where I was positioned, which was near the side of the table where his feet would be visible if he moved them. He started tapping. Not hard, not fast. Just a small, even rhythm like someone who is waiting for something to start. The foot tapping went on for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and then it stopped all at once, like he had caught himself doing it and decided to stop. And when the foot stopped, something else changed in the room, something about the energy or the pressure or whatever you want to call it. And I remember thinking in that moment that he had just shown us something he did not mean to show us. The third tell was the smile. This one is harder to describe because it is not something you see on a face. It is something you see in the timing of a face. He smiled at the wrong moment. I do not mean he smiled when he should not have. I mean he smiled after the moment had already passed. Michelle said something. I do not remember the exact words. It was a sentence, maybe 2 sentences, something about process or timing, something that was not confrontational, just procedural. And he did not smile while she was speaking. He did not smile the moment she finished. He smiled 2 seconds later, and the smile was a little too wide, and it lasted a little too long, and it was the kind of smile that a person puts on when they are trying to convince themselves and everyone else that they are not bothered by something that is bothering them. I have seen that smile before. I have worn that smile. It is the smile of a person who is pretending. Here is what I am going to tell you now, and I need you to understand that I am only telling you this because the next part only makes sense if you know it first. There was a phone call. 5 minutes before he walked into the room. I was in the hallway outside doing something. I do not remember what, probably checking on the water situation or making sure the papers were in the right order, and I heard him on the phone. Not the whole conversation, just parts. He was talking to someone, and he said, I know twice, and he said, think once, and then he said, I will, and he hung up. That was it. He hung up and he put the phone in his pocket and he walked into the room. At the time I thought it was nothing. People make phone calls. I did not think about it again until later that night when I was writing everything down and I thought about the phone call and I thought about what I know and I will could have meant in that context, and I started to wonder whether the phone call was connected to something in the room. I still do not know for certain. I just know the phone call happened, and the phone call happened 5 minutes before he walked in, and he looked different when he walked in than he had looked in the hallway. Not different in an obvious way, different in a small way. Like someone who had just been told something they were not expecting. I told you there were 3 things I would explain later. I have told you 1, there are 2 more, I will get to them. I need to tell you about the confrontation itself now, but I am not going to tell you what you already know. You have seen the footage. You know what was said. You know the words. I am going to tell you what was not said and what I saw while the words were being said, because the words are not the part that matters. The part that matters is what was happening underneath the words, in the space between the sentences, in the things that the cameras could not see because the cameras were pointed at faces and not at the rest of the body. The thing about Michelle Obama is that she did not move. That is the thing. She sat there and she was still and she watched, and she did not react in the way that you might expect a person to react when they are being talked to in a certain tone of voice by a certain type of person. She just sat there, and her hands were on the table, and her shoulders were relaxed, and her face was doing something that I do not have a word for, something that was not a smile and was not a frown and was not a blank, but was instead a kind of patient attention, like she was waiting for something specific to happen, and she already knew what it was. I remember thinking at one point that she looked like someone who had been in a lot of rooms like this before. Not this exact room, not this exact event, but a room. A room where someone was trying to create an impression and failing. A room where the energy was not what the person at the head of the table wanted it to be. She had been in rooms like that before, and she knew how to sit in them, and she knew how to wait, and she was not afraid, and that was the thing. The not being afraid part. That is what I remember most about her from that room. He was trying, that is the other thing I remember. He was trying, and he was not succeeding, and he did not seem to know that he was not succeeding, at least not at first. He was moving his hands. He was making his voice louder and then softer. He was leaning forward and then sitting back. He was doing all the things that a person does when they are trying to control a room, and the room was not controlling. The room was just sitting there. The room was just being a room, and the people in the room were just being people, and the cameras were just being cameras, and he was the only one who seemed to think that something important was happening. Here is the second thing I told you I would explain later. The chair, the one that was 2 inches lower than the others, the one with the newer cushion. I found out that afternoon why the chair had been switched. Someone had called in the morning and asked for the chair to be changed. That was the instruction. Make sure the chair is the right one. I did not know what the right one meant. I know now. The chair was lower so that he would be slightly below eye level with the people across the table. That was not an accident. I do not know who called. I do not know who made that decision. I am just telling you what I learned later because I told you I would explain it, and this is the moment when it fits. He noticed, near the end. He shifted in the chair and he looked at the producer and he said something that I could not hear, and the producer shook their head and he said something else, and the producer shook their head again. And then he sat back down and he did not say anything for maybe 30 seconds, and that was the moment, that 30-second stretch, right there, that was when I first thought that something had changed. Not visibly, not in a way that would show up on a camera that was pointed at his face. But in the room, in the temperature of the room, in the air, something had shifted, and I do not have a better way to say it than that. Something in the room had shifted, and he felt it, and he did not know what to do about it, and nobody else in the room knew what to do about it except for one person, and that one person was sitting perfectly still and saying nothing. I want to tell you about T. He quiet revelation now, because this is the part of the story that I have not heard anyone else tell, and it is the part that matters most to me. And I need you to understand that I am only telling you this because I was the only person in the room who was close enough to hear what happened next. There was a moment, about 2/3 of the way through. The cameras were still rolling, the room was still active, and Michelle Obama turned to her husband, just slightly, just enough, and she said something to him. I could not hear the whole sentence. I heard maybe 3 words. I heard let him and then something that sounded like finish or talk. I am not sure because she said it very quietly and I was 6 feet away and my hearing is not perfect and I am giving you what I remember and not what I am certain about. But I heard enough. I heard the tone, and the tone was not nervousness. The tone was not worry. The tone was something else. The tone was the tone of a person who has already seen the end of something and is deciding whether to let it play out or to interrupt it. And the decision she made was to let it play out. Barack Obama nodded, just barely, a nod that was almost invisible, and then he turned back to the table and he looked at the other person and he said something. And what he said, this is the part, what he said was not what was on the teleprompter. I know this because I could see the teleprompter screen from where I was standing, and what was on the teleprompter was something about process and timing and the schedule for the day, and what Barack Obama said was not that. What he said was something else. What he said was a question. The question was simple, 3 words, maybe 4. I will tell you exactly what I heard. I heard him say, "Is that what you think?" And the other person, the one across the table, the one who had been talking and moving and gesturing and trying to fill the room with the sound of his own voice, he did not answer. He did not answer right away. He swallowed. The swallow came late. And then he said something, but it was not an answer. It was a retreat. It was a sentence that started in one direction and then turned in another direction mid-word, like he had said something he did not mean to say and had to change course before the change was visible. And the cameras did not catch that. The cameras caught his face, which looked almost the same. But the cameras did not catch what I saw, which was the body. The body had already answered the question before the mouth did. The body had said no. The body had said, "I do not have a good answer for that." The body had said, "I did not think this would go this way." And the mouth was late, as mouths often are, and the mouth said something that did not matter because the body had already told the truth. I will tell you the third thing I held back now, because I am almost at the end, and I want you to have all of it." Before the cameras started rolling, Michelle Obama walked past where I was standing. She was on her way to her seat, and she looked at me, just for a second, just long enough for me to notice, and she said, "Are you ready?" That was the question. "Are you ready?" Not a greeting, not small talk, not something polite, just that. And I said yes, and she nodded, and she kept walking, and I have thought about that question every day since then. I have thought about what she meant by it. I have thought about whether she was asking me if I was ready for something, or whether she was asking herself, or whether she was just being kind to a person who was standing near a door holding a clipboard, or whether she already knew something that I did not know yet and she was checking to see if I knew it too. I do not know. I have never known. I have never asked anyone. And I am telling you this now because I told you I would explain the three things, and this is the last one. The end is coming. I want to stay with the moment a little longer if you do not mind. I want to tell you what happened after the question was asked and the answer was not given. The room did not know. That is the thing I want you to understand. The room did not know what had just happened. The cameras were still rolling. The producers were still watching the monitors. The press people were still sitting in their chairs taking notes on things that did not matter. Nobody in the room knew that the confrontation had ended, not in the way the footage would later suggest it ended, but in the way that matters, in the body, in the breath, in the pause that came one beat too late. Nobody knew except for two people in that room, and one of them was the person who had asked the question, and the other one was me. I want to tell you about the handshake. At the end, when the cameras stopped. The cameras stopped and everyone stood up and there was the normal movement of people and the handshake happened and I was close enough to hear what Barack Obama said NTO the other person's ear during the handshake. 3 words, I know exactly what I heard. He said, "We'll be in touch." That is all, 3 words. And the other person nodded and walked out of the room, and the room was just a room again, and the chairs were just chairs, and the stale coffee was still sitting there in the urn in the corner. And I was standing near the door holding my clipboard, and my hands were shaking, and I did not know why. I know why now. I want to tell you the last thing before I stop talking. I have not told anyone this. I need you to understand that I have not told anyone this until now. I did not sleep that night or the next night. I lay in my bed and I stared at the ceiling and I kept replaying the question, the way he had asked it, the way the other person had not answered it, the way Michelle Obama had turned to her husband before it happened and said something I could not quite hear. I kept thinking about what "we'll be in touch" meant. I kept thinking about the chair. I kept thinking about the phone call in the hallway, the one I did not understand, the one I still do not understand. I kept thinking about the way he had walked into the room and filled the doorway, and I kept thinking about the way he had sat in the lower chair and not known why it mattered. I am telling you this because I need you to know that what I saw was not what you saw. What I saw was a person who thought he was in control of a room and was not. What I saw was a person who had been called 5 minutes before and told something and walked in with the wrong idea. What I saw was a person who did not know that the person across from him already knew the ending and was just deciding whether to let it play out. What I saw was a swallow that came 1 beat too late. What I saw was a foot that started tapping and then stopped. What I saw was a smile that arrived 2 seconds after it should have. What I saw was a man who sat in a chair that was 2 inches too low and did not know why he felt small. That is what I saw, and I have never told anyone. The coffee smell is still there. I do not know why I keep coming back to it. It is just stale coffee. It is just a room that smelled like a room that was waiting. But it is the thing I remember most, and I do not know if that is because of what happened in that room or because of what happened to me after I left it. I think maybe it is both. I think maybe the smell became the memory, and the memory became the story, and the story became the thing I have been holding for years, waiting for the right moment to let it go. I think this is the moment,